Hello again, Year 9s. Here's my hand. I am today going to talk about changing the subject of a formula. Now, this again is a topic that we've covered before, but we're going to cover it in more detail today. I'm going to do an awful lot of examples for you, trying to remind you of what changing the subject really means and how to go about it. So we talked about formulae last lesson. So I'm going to write a formula down here for you. And what I would like you to do with all of these examples, please, is to make sure that you copy them down into your books and understand what we've done at each stage. So example 1, we're going to have a formula. And the formula we're going to have is A equals 2p plus D. Now what we're going to do here is we are going to make P the subject, and we're going to do that for the first few of these. So I'm going to make P the subject at the top here. Now what does that even mean? Well, at the moment in this formula, A is the subject, and that's because it's the letter that's sitting on its own to one side of the equals sign. And then there are various letters, variables as we call them, on the other side of the formula over here. So at the moment, A is the subject. We would like P to be the subject, which means that we would like this formula to be rearranged so that it's a P equals something formula. Now, in order to do the rearrangements, we can use all the normal rules of algebra. So use any normal rule of algebra. And the main one that we really need to think about is that anything you do to one side of an equation, you must do to the other side. So anything you do to one side of an equation must be done to the other side, otherwise it won't be equal anymore. Must also be done to the other side. Right, and that rule we're going to use for lots of examples, but I'm not going to write the rule down again, okay? So let's go back to our formula here. A equals 2p plus D, and we want to get it so that P is the subject, P is on its own. So first of all, we have to look at where P is in this formula. It's here in the middle. And what is happening to that P? Well, that P is being multiplied by 2, and it's had a D added onto it. Yeah, so it's been multiplied by 2 and had a D added onto it. Now, just for this very first example, I'm going to write that out as a sort of in function form. So I've got this P, I have multiplied it by 2, that's made it into a 2p, and then I have added a D onto it, and that's made it into a 2p plus a D. If I want to get to the point where I've got a P on its own, I've got to reverse this. I've got to do the operations that have happened to this P to get it to be a 2p plus D in reverse order. So if I'm going to reverse this, I'm going to start off by subtracting a D, and then I am going to not multiply by 2. What's the opposite of multiplying? It's dividing by 2. And remember, I've got to do that to both sides of my formula. So that is the reverse. That's the way that you get to change the subject of your formula. You reverse out the operations. You do a minus D, and then you do a divide by 2 in this case. So keep writing out this formula. I'm going to write it out one more time. A equals 2p plus D. So reversing out, doing what I've was done to the P, but in reverse order, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to subtract a D. I have to do that from both sides. So this side will be an A minus D, And over this side, I'm just left with a 2p. Yeah, I've taken d away, I've subtracted d from both sides. Next thing I have to do is divide by 2. So dividing by 2, both sides, a minus d over 2 equals p. And now the p is sitting on its own. I have changed the subject of the formula to being p. I'm not going to write all this out in future examples that I do, but I think it's important that you have it written out for this first example so that you can see what we're trying to do. We're trying to understand where the thing that we're making the subject of the formula sits in our formula. What's happened to it? It's been times by 2, it's had a d added to it. To get that p on its own, we've got to strip those things away, but we've got to do them in the right order. And the right order in this case is going to be the reverse order of what happened to it originally. Reverse order in this case was to subtract the d first and then to divide by 2. So you take your formula, you subtract the d from both sides. Remember, anything you do to one side of an equation you must also have done to the other side, and then you divide by 2. Okay, I'm about to rub this off my board, so if you need to pause the video at this point, you do that. I've got about 7 or 8 other examples to do, but I'm going to do them a little bit more quickly, and I'm not going to do all this writing in them, okay? So I do want you to copy all of these examples down and make sure that you understand them as we go through. Okay, so still making p the subject, these first few. So I'm now moving on to example 2. And here I've got t equals mp minus c. So we're going to look and see where this p lies. We're making p the subject. So where does it lie? It's been multiplied by an m and it's had a c taken away from it. Multiplied by m, take away c. We're going to do that in reverse order, reversing the operations. So instead of a minus c, the last thing that happened, we're going to add a c. T plus c equals mp. Yeah, I've added c to both sides of this operation, of this formula. This p has been multiplied by an m I wanted on its own, so I divide by the m. T plus c divided by m equals p. I've done the same thing to both sides of my formula. I have divided both of them by m. So just recap. Originally, so we wanted to get to this p had been multiplied by an m and then had a c taken away. We're going to reverse out those operations in reverse order. Minus c was the last thing that happened to it, so plus c is the first thing we're going to do as we're starting to change the subject. First thing that had happened to it was it had been multiplied by an m, so the last thing we're going to do is we're going to divide by an m to reverse that out. So that's there. Okay, example 3. Still making p the subject. I've got q equals p divided by 4 plus 2. So look at your formula. We want to make p the subject. What's happened to it? It's been divided by 4 to start with and has had 2 added to it. So we're going to reverse those operations in reverse order. Last thing that happened to it was a plus 2. So the first thing we're going to do is subtract 2 from both sides. Q minus 2 on this side equals p over 4. The plus 2 disappears because we've subtracted 2. This is a p divided by 4. We don't want it to be divided by 4. We want to therefore reverse that out. Reverse operation of divided by 4 is multiply by 4. So we're going to multiply both sides by 4. So I'm going to put a 4 outside a bracket here. You know we're allowed to do that, aren't we? That has multiplied all of this side by 4, and that's equal to p. Last example with making P the subject. So example 4. Here I've got M equals P plus B all over A. Look at what's happened this time to the P that we're trying to get to. It's had a B added to it. That was the first thing that happened to it. And then it was divided by A. The whole thing was divided by A. So the last thing to happen to it was divided by A. So the first thing that we need to reverse out is the divide by A. So we're going to multiply by A to reverse that out. We have to do that to both sides. So we have an M multiplied by an A equals a P plus B. Our P is sitting there. It's got a plus B on it. We need to reverse that out. So to reverse a plus B, we need to subtract the B. That's going to be an MA minus B on this side. Same thing to both sides. Equals P. So if you haven't got those copied down, pause the video for a moment and just make sure that you've got those copied down before I rub them off my board, which I'm going to do now. Right, move on to some slightly harder examples now. The idea is the same though. We will still be changing the subject. With these ones, I'm going to have a different letter. With these ones, I'm going to make Y the subject. And we're just going to introduce a few different operations into these ones, but the principle is going to be exactly the same. So I think we're on something like example 5 now. And my formula for example 5 is A equals 2 minus the square root, I'm going to make it plus actually, the square root of Y. Okay, so we have to think about what has happened to this Y. If we're going to make Y the subject, what's happened to it? Well, it's been square rooted and it's had a 2 added to it. So the first thing we're going to want to do is get rid of the 2 that it's had added to it. So let's subtract 2. Remember, we have to do that from both sides. A minus 2 equals the square root of Y. And then what do we do to get rid of a square root? Well, we have to do the reverse of the operation. And the reverse operation to a square root is a square. So we're going to square both sides. I'll write that as a word, square both sides. If we're going to square A minus 2, we ought to put it in a bracket to show that we've squared the whole thing. And that's going to give me Y. Okay, example 6. Just introducing these squares and square roots. So this time I've got V equals 3y squared minus 5. I want to make Y my subject. What has happened to the Y here? Well, a few things have happened to it. Think about BODMAS and this 3 and this 2. The first thing that's happened to it, we always do powers first or index first, don't we? So it's been squared, then it's been multiplied by 3, and then it's had 5 taken away from it. And I think I might just write, because this one is a bit more complicated, I'm just going to write this out as in sort of a function form. So Y has been squared, so that made it into a Y squared. Then it was multiplied by a 3, that made it into a 3y squared, and then it had a 5 taken away from it. So that made it into a 3y squared minus 5. If you get a complicated one, there is no harm at all in writing it out like this so you know what has happened to it. And then you know you've got to reverse it. So instead of a minus 5, you've got to have a plus 5. Instead of a Multiply by 3, you're going to have a divide by 3, and instead of a square, you're going to have a square root. So let's go through then and use these reverse operations in this order. So I'll write it out again just to start with. Minus 5. Right, first thing I'm going to do is add 5 to both sides. Add 5. V plus 5 equals 3y squared. The next thing we're going to do is divide by 3. Divide by 3. V plus 5 all divided by 3 equals y squared. And the last thing we're going to do is the square root. Square root. Put a big square root sign all the way around all of this, so you can see that the whole thing needs to be square rooted. V plus 5 over 3 equals y. Yeah? So, harder examples this time. This one's harder because it's got 3 things happening, a square, a times 3 and a minus 5. But they just show you that using squares and square roots, just the same idea as with other operations, we need to do the reverse. Yeah, so here we had a square root, so we ended up squaring it. Here we had a square, so we ended up square rooting it. Okay, I've got 2 more examples to show you. I can't remember where we're up to in our numbers. Are we up to about number 7, I think, aren't we? Right. So with this one, we're going to make, we'll still make y the subject. So example 7. And here I've got ay plus by equals c. Now, what makes this different is that the thing that we want to make the subject, the y, appears in more than one place in our formula. Now that's going to make it harder to change the subject because we want to get it just so that y is on its own equal to something. So we go back to a skill that we learned this year. We go back to the skill of factorising. You know, when you've got a common factor between more than one term in an expression, you can put that common factor on the outside of a bracket and put something inside the bracket that makes it equivalent to the expression that you started with. So you look for your common factor. Clearly the common factor here is going to be y. So we've got y. And then in our brackets, to make it the same as this, we'd need to have an a plus b, wouldn't we? Equal to c. And suddenly it becomes much easier and quicker to see what you would need to do next. We want to get a y on its own. At the moment, the y is multiplied by this thing in the bracket. We know that if we want to reverse out a multiplication, we need to divide. So this first step, I factorised, so I'll write that down there. The next step, we're going to divide by your bracket. So we end up with y equals c over, doesn't need to be in a bracket, but I'll write it in a bracket to make it really clear, over the bracket. The bracket is divided by, and that's our expression for y. Now, these can sometimes be a little bit harder. Same idea, this one, but just requires a bit of an extra step. So example 8, I've got py plus q equals ry plus s. So my issue here is similar to the one that I had up here, in that my y is in more than one place in my formula, but this time it's on different sides of the equal sign. So what I've got to do is make sure that I get my y's onto the same side of the equal sign and everything else onto the other side. So I want it to look like this one looked at like to start with. All my y's on one side, other things onto the other side. So I'm going to say collect y's on one side. How do I do that? Well, I can, in this case, I can just subtract ry. So I'll have py plus q minus ry on this side equaling s rather, not x. But I don't really want this q here because at the moment I can't do this factorising thing that I did up with my previous example. So I'm going to make sure that the q is on the other side. To do that, I need to subtract q. So I've got py minus ry equals s minus my q. Now I can do my factorising. Okay, so my next step is to factorise. So I can put my y outside my bracket because it's a common factor of these two. Inside my bracket I'd need to have a p minus an r. I have an s minus a q over there. And then final step, same as the final step was here, I'm going to divide by my bracket. Y equals s minus q over p minus r. And for both of these, I don't really need to have the bracket there, but I was just showing you the bracket in there just so that you can see what it is that I've moved across. There you go. Now, for most of you, you can stop there. I'm just going to show you one more example though, that is just a little bit different. And I just want you to just sort of understand it. The principles of what we've done are exactly the same. So there is another example. So if you want to sort of just make sure that you pause this to get these examples down. I'm just going to show you this last example because it's got a sign in it that makes it a little bit trickier to deal with. And negative signs are one of those things that sort of we do sometimes have a bit of an issue with in maths. We don't always remember to treat them correctly. So I'm just going to show you how you can potentially treat this one. So I've got a equals, oh, this is example 9, isn't it? Even though I said I was only doing 8 examples. Here we go. A equals 2 minus root y. Now, we want to make y the subject and y is there. So what you could say here, there are two possible approaches, What you could say here is that the y has gone through this process. So it's gone through the square rooting process. It's got a negative sign in front of it, so it's been multiplied by -1, making it a minus root y. And then it's had a 2 added to it. So then it becomes 2 minus root y. So to reverse that process, we'd need to subtract 2. We'd need to divide by -1. And then we'd need to square. And that will work. So we'll just do that. And I will just show you how that's done. So we start with the original. So we're going to subtract 2. So we'll end up with a minus 2 on this side and minus root y on that side. Then we divide by -1. If we're dividing by -1, we're dividing by a negative, and so all of our signs are going to change. So this is going to become minus a plus 2, and this is going to become just root y. And then the final thing we're going to do is square it. So this whole thing, minus a plus 2 gets squared. That equals y. I never like starting something with a negative, so I think there I would just write 2 minus a instead. So we've basically gone through the whole process. The thing that is probably just the thing that we really need to focus on though is this negative sign here. Yeah. That just is tricky because if it was a plus 3y or something, you'd be able to see it very clearly. But the fact that it's just a minus sign, it does mean that it's multiplied by -1, and I think people do forget that. So I've just got an alternative method of doing this. I'm going to just write this at the bottom here. And some of you might prefer this. So we start with a equals 2 minus root y. I don't like the negativeness of the root y, so I'm going to add it to both sides. A plus root y equals 2. Then I'm going to subtract the a, or I should say actually add root y, that's what I've done. Then I'm going to subtract the a, and I'm just left with a root y on this side, minus a. And then, I'm sure you can see what I'm going to do here, I'm going to square both sides, and that's going to give me y equals 2 minus a squared. Now I think that's a little bit easier, but it isn't strictly following the method that we've done here. What I've done to start with is I've said I don't like this minus root y on this side, so I'm going to add it to both sides, which means that it will turn up here as a plus root y equaling 2. And then I've gone for making y the subject by subtracting the a and squaring. So some of you might prefer that. If I was doing this, I would probably do it that way. But this is the step-by-step approach that we've been using so far. Okay, hopefully that has made making y the subject, changing the subject of a formula a bit clearer. We've done loads of examples now. So when you do the questions from the book, hopefully you'll be able to work through them using the same approach. Please set your workings out as I've set them out. You don't always need to do this step, but certainly you do need to write out this sort of stage here, where you're rearranging your equation each time, keeping the equal sign in place and doing the same thing to both sides of the equation. Okay, so you'll be doing some more questions from chapter 6.1, and those questions will be set for you on Insight.